Absolutely. Because like many things, they're not my rules. That I heard them and introduced them to this conversation. But as I understand it, these three simple rules. I'll say what they are first. So look after yourself, look after each other, and look after this place. And as I recall, I heard that a story about those rules first from Margaret Wheatley, and it was based on a school in Oregon where the school had taken the unusual step of asking its pupils to come up with rules to help them govern themselves. So it was a kind of a brainstorming around, what simple rules do we need? And this is what they came up with. And in many ways, obviously these rules aren't prescriptive about specific behaviors, but they're simple enough to be intelligible. They don't tell you what to do, but they kind of tell you where to look. So
I like that.
they're not prescriptive, but they force everybody to think and actually say, you know what, that how we govern ourselves here is up to all of us. There's no external authority policing a set of kind of minute and specific rules. And so at any point in time, as questions, you can ask yourself, am I looking after myself? You might have to think about what would that mean, like, do I need quiet or silence? So at Basecamp in London, we had a quiet room, a silent room, to which people could withdraw at any point of their own free will. And so that was an invitation to them to find and use that particular way of looking after themselves if that's what they needed. Looking after each other goes beyond the courtesy. It's about understanding that we are in this together, that we are weaving and co-creating. And so to look after each other is to respect the whole as well, and to understand that if people don't have space, or if one voice is dominating, or if we're getting into conflict, that is not to be looking after each other. And looking after this place, that is the context in which we sit. So simple attention to how we're organized and how we are gathering, where we're sitting. Do we sit around a boardroom table? Do we sit around a circle? It's an invitation to consider how the physical setting is influencing what we're able to do. So I think those are my favorite kind of rules, super simple ones that you can easily remember, and which generate good questions for you to constantly be asking. Now I think, sorry, yeah.
No, I was just gonna. I had nothing profound to add to that. But I mean, when a couple ones, tensions, and I appreciate that the rules are stated, and then we all have kind of the agency to explore their meaning.
Absolutely.
Which I think is great. I do think, it's interesting what those rules have kind of made me reflect upon. The first one, look after yourself. One thing that you talk about, sort of the difference in similarity. For me, looking after myself is very different from standing up for myself.
Yeah.
And I feel like in the kind of conversations we gather, that it's far more important to look after myself. I think everyone who kind of comes to these gatherings in a way has already stood up. And pretty much everyone that I meet in the gatherings, no one is there to try to put me down,
right,
or to make me small. But actually, and I think a lot of people maybe share this experience, is I put myself down all the time. I make myself small.
Yeah.
And so the part of looking after myself is to kind of, recognize my whole self, recognize that this is not just rhetoric, that I do have a kind of an equal value to sit around. That's why we're sitting in, a circle around a metaphorical campfire. We are all equal under the sun. Mm-hmm. And whatever that means, here is a place to kind of explore that and to come from that place. So that's been really helpful for me, that particular one. And then looking after this place, in a world where there's so much, and I think especially because of social media, just so many virtual spaces that are about selling, dominating, pushing my agenda, justifying, explaining, getting everyone behind my actions,
Yeah, it's true.
getting offended at the words that, you know, without trying to understand the intent behind them. I think it really is important that the space itself is kind of represented as, there is a broader purpose here being held, and let's try to listen, speak, and act in the context of this broader purpose, which is to kind of bring the intelligence and diversity that we all represent into a kind of common pool that enriches us all.
Again, it's easier perhaps to talk about what it's not, in the sense that what we're not doing here is advocating. So this is not some sort of macro debating society where people come with positions or points of view. And I think your point about social media is well made, that the very nature of social media, whatever one thinks about it, is that one is encouraged implicitly or explicitly to advocate, to adopt positions, to say things starkly and boldly. And there are occasions when that's helpful, but in Basecamp, what we're trying to do is to open up, to share, to see what other people make of things, not to convince them of it. I'm always struck how in Spanish, I speak Spanish much of the time, the verb to convince, which is convencer, which literally means to be victorious over. And so it has a sort of, to convince somebody of something has a kind of violence, if you will, hidden in the word. And so Basecamp is about just allowing ourselves a space where that's not the case. Not everything has to be adversarial or about scoring points and winning. There are arenas where that's appropriate, but this isn't one of them.
I love that that insight about convince, and there's a conquest that happens in it. And I like to think of Basecamp as much more space to where we're all just making invitations to one another.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there can be a couple of sides to that. Like if I say something, you agree with it, maybe the invitation is let's explore that thing we agree more. Yeah. If I say something and you think like, my God, Chris, like that is, I fundamentally have issue with that. But it's so interesting that that's how you understand this.
Yeah.
And that's an invitation to let's talk about that fundamental disagreement, because I never imagined that we would have one.
Right. And so the opportunity there for, well, let me understand why we disagree. Let me understand why you hold the view that you hold. And there might be lots of options hidden in that. It might be that we're actually disagreeing in the way we're using words. It might be that we're seeing something differently. It might be that we agree about a kind of a premise, but disagree about a conclusion. But we can get into that. We can wade into that and really increase our understanding by not judging.
Maybe this is just like one more subtlety on this point, but I think it's why it feels right to me to think of Basecamp as a space, which is sort of it's a gathering place, but there's not a kind of it's not a ship, it's not a vehicle that is trying to get to a specific destination. Where if it were, I think that the winning the argument would have it might have more priority.
Right.
Because at the end of this meeting, we've all got to agree on a direction.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that it's my direction.
Yeah.
But when it is an immobile space, that's no longer necessary.
Yeah.
Right. And so we can actually ask ourselves, like, why are we spending so much time on disagreement? We don't have to convince one another here.
And in a way, what you're referring to there is a shift from what might be called in leadership, heroic leadership to post-heroic leadership. So, in heroic leadership, traditionally, it is about getting a group of people from here to there, whether there is normally quite well defined or quite clear. In an era where it's not clear where there is, then a different leadership, kind of form of leadership is required, which is often the metaphors used are about hosting, holding, gardening, cultivating, nurturing. And so it's in that spirit that Basecamp is a space. And so it's important to understand that, in this context, that's the kind of leadership that Basecamp is offering to people, is to hold the space to which people come, from which they go out into the world to pursue projects, expeditions, and reach destinations. But the nature of this space, as you say, is that it doesn't move. It invites people in.